As you will no doubt know by now, we aren't exactly huge fans of censorship around here. We like it when artistic expression is allowed to go down every avenue that it wants to, and if people don't like it, then they can simply not consume it. Unfortunately, not a lot of people agree with this sentiment, and they still think that things should be censored. We've heard of censorship by religious institutions, governments, political groups, and all of the other usual suspects, but today we're going to talk about Hollywood. At the start of the 1900s, society was very different. Everything was very prim and proper, and Hollywood movies were exploding onto the scene. But people were very concerned about the effect that this new form of media would have on society. So, it was decided that there should be rules regulating what movies were allowed to show people. And some of these rules were pretty stupid. The Hays Code. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the mad lad, this video is brought to you by Raycon. With Raycon earbuds, you can optimise your listening experience with mind-blowing quality at half the price of other premium audio brands. The new everyday earbuds are better than ever, with an improved rubber look and a feel that is both sleek and discreet, as well as including multiple optimised gel tips to provide that perfect fit for maximum comfort, sound and security, regardless of the shape and size of your ears. Raycons are more versatile than ever, with a built-in mic that will allow you to take calls at the press of a button, and they also offer 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life, and 48,000 5-star reviews. My Raycons are great for when I do my morning workout, and one of the things I like most about them is the audio quality. It's got that bass. So if you want to get some top tier earbuds while supporting my channel, then click the link in the description down below or go to buyraycon.com/Dankula to get an exclusive deal of up to 15% off of your order. In the early 1900s, religion was a lot more important in the West, and a Catholic priest named Daniel A. Lord started to write the production code for Hollywood films because, in his words, he was in the presence of a medium so powerful that it would change people's attitudes towards life, civilization, and established customs, which is something that he thought would be a great threat to the church. Movies that were released prior to the production code were referred to as pre-code films, or more colloquially, the unmentionables. One example being the Great Train Robbery, which was seen as alarming and distasteful by viewers due to a scene where a gun is being pointed directly at the camera towards the audience, which made them all very frightened. Which shows the level of intelligence that we're dealing with here. It was also pushed that only undesirable characters of low morality would go to see such a horrible thing as a pre-code film. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 ended the prosperity of the 1920s, movie makers were caught between the sexually suggestive tastes of the jazz era and the economic realities of the Great Depression, and films that slipped through the cracks reflected that. Society seemed to shift towards a more conservative attitude, likely due to the kinds of films Hollywood studios were creating at the height of the Depression between 1930 and 1934. With less money in people's pockets for going to see movies, studios tried to lure audiences in via their morbid curiosity, with films that featured sex, violence, alcoholism, and the grotesque. with movies like Babyface, Freaks and Scarface, the 1932 one, not the Al Pacino one, whose storylines either glamorised gangsters, showed highly sexual scenes, or reflected class struggle. Things that the church would rather people didn't see. Another contributing factor for people wanting to rein Hollywood in was the fact that Hollywood in the 1920s had suffered a large number of major scandals. These included the murder of the Irish-American film director William Desmond Taylor and the alleged rape and death of Virginia Rapp by Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was defended by both Charlie Chaplin and an earlier mad lad that we've covered, Buster Keaton. Though, despite being defended by his friends, Fatty's career was over. As a result of all of this, Hollywood's image was sinking into the toilet. So, in 1922, a devout Presbyterian elder named William Harrison Hayes was brought in to help improve Hollywood's image, since at this time, morality mattered more to the average person than it does now, and many organisations were starting to get very vocal about Hollywood's practices, with religious groups also stating that no picture should ever be produced that may lower the moral standards of those who see it. As a result of all of this fuss, it wasn't long before politicians started to get involved, and in 1921, many states started tabling differing legislation to regulate what Hollywood could and couldn't show people. This, however, would have been a complete nightmare for Hollywood to deal with because they would have to comply with hundreds of ever-changing laws that were all different in each state. This would have created a complete nightmare scenario where a movie that could be played in Iowa couldn't be played in Texas, but a movie that could be played in Texas couldn't be played in Arizona or California. Oh wait, never mind, not California anymore. Their laws actually changed. Arizona's also changed the other week. There was just no way in hell that Hollywood could keep up with all of that. So the studios decided that self-regulation would be a much better option, and they proposed to create their own rules that the states would then all agree with, making these rules universal across all states and avoiding all of that complete headache. And these new rules would be enforced by the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, which was led by William Harrison Hayes. This code was officially called the Motion Picture Production Code, but it was colloquially referred to as the Hayes Code. On the 29th of June 1927, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America codified their list of rules, detailing things that were just flat out banned, as well as things that could be shown, but only if they were shown in a moral way. An image was created consisting of most of the don'ts, which all seem relatively quite tame by today's standards. The code itself was actually a collective work by the entire industry and also religious advisors such as Daniel Lord, who was actually the first one to start writing the code, and it was a self-imposed set of guidelines for all movies that were released between 1934 and 1968. The code prohibited profanity, which included taking the Lord's name in vain, prostitution, sexual perversion, and suggestive nudity. Not even cleavage. You weren't even allowed to show cleavage. In fact, even the silhouette of a woman's body was not allowed. And one of the most well-known rules, men and women were not allowed to sleep in the same bed, which is why in Hays Code movies, you always see married couples sleeping in separate beds. The code also had rules around the use of crime, such as theft, robbery, safecracking, and dynamiting of trains, mines, or buildings, because they believed that this would help less intelligent criminals to commit crimes. Basically, movies could not show people exactly how to commit certain crimes. Like, if in the movie the criminal was breaking into a safe, they were not allowed to show a realistic depiction of this is how you break into this type of safe, otherwise real criminals would just use it as a guidebook. The movies were also not allowed to show any kind of sympathy towards criminality of any kind. If a character in a movie was bad, then they had to receive negative consequences for their actions by the end of the movie. It basically reinforced the whole Hollywood thing of the bad guy must always get what is coming to him. Costumes, dance, religion, national sentiment, and morality were also heavily censored for propaganda purposes and to keep everyone in line socially. This is likely why around this time people would try their best to keep up appearances, even though life is not as perfect as the Hays Code would have liked, and cultural variety exists for better or for worse, and, well, they were still in the middle of a gigantic fucking depression. People during this time still always went out of their way to be very presentable and well dressed. Basically, they went out every single day in their Sunday best. And the reason that people really started doing that a lot is because that's how the characters in movies dressed. There was another rule against any graphic or realistic violence or rape. Those were obviously added to the ban list since the movies under the code had to be tame. The violence and stuff like that could not be over the top. It had to be, pretty basic. Although these were sometimes given a little bit of a pass if it was violence happening to a bad guy, because it was part of the bad guy's comeuppance for not being a good and moral person. Because one of the main things that the code wanted to reinforce into people's heads is be a good and moral person or bad things will happen to you. And obviously, since agents of the church had a huge hand in drafting the Hays Code, there was obviously a rule that said you were not allowed to ridicule the clergy or the church, because, as we know, the church doesn't exactly take criticism too well. And also one of the rules that the church added, which was typically prudish for the religious, but still kind of a weird one, was that there could be no scenes of childbirth at all. Whatsoever. Not even if it was done using silhouettes. Silhouettes is something that directors used to use back in the day so that they could kind of show something but not actually show it, thereby skirting past all the rules. But to preempt this, they actually included in the code even with silhouettes. So not even with silhouettes. Completely, utterly banned. I'm not sure why. I think that they thought that maybe the devil would tempt men who saw this into lust after they saw what is essentially a punched lasagna. One rule in the code that I'm sure we can all agree with, at least I hope we all agree on it, is literally written as no children's sex organs. So basically, no noncery. Which, yeah, absolutely fair. Yep, I would say that is the most sensible rule on the list. That is a good rule that no normal person would have an issue with. If only the church could follow their own rules. Some of the code was a lot more politically driven, which as a result meant that a lot of Americans did not know much or anything about the Nazis, even when the Nazi government was in full swing. The American public didn't really learn much about them until it was time to go to war with them. And the reason for that is because movies had to be sensitive towards international relations. After all, we couldn't risk a Hollywood movie causing offence to another nation that America wanted to maintain a good relationship with. So Hollywood had to be so careful about portraying foreign governments that a lot of the time they just didn't, because it wasn't worth the hassle. And now for some of the more spicy rules in the code. There was to be no miscegenation, no race mixing or interracial romance of any form at all was allowed on film. Even in the later years, while the code was being heavily challenged, in one of the earliest romance scenes between a black woman and a white man, in the script, they were supposed to kiss. And this is all they could get away with. That apparently was a kiss, but really it was just fucking awkward. And though they did get away with whatever that was in the sense that they were still allowed to show it, they did still get into trouble for that. In another rule, it stated that white people should never be portrayed as slaves. In any circumstance, you were not allowed to show white slavery. Though some movies did manage to get around that rule if their movie was set during Roman times. Another rule was that no perversion should be in the movie. And you would think that perversion might cover a broad scope of things, but what they really meant was homosexuality. Showing homosexuality in any way, even hinting towards it, was completely, utterly banned. Illegal, verboten, forbidden, don't gay. Of course, over the years, a lot of people started to grow tired of the moral grandstanding. Writers and directors disliked the limitations of their art form. Stories are often best told when you don't put any limits on how people are allowed to tell them. The Italian movie L'Amour, which was released in 1948 and pretty much absolutely disregarded the Hays Code, led the Supreme Court to grant movies First Amendment protection and limit government regulation of Hollywood, which was one of the earliest direct challenges to the Hays Code's authority. The problem was that the Hays Code wasn't government regulation. It was self-regulation by Hollywood itself. So if any directors wanted the help and approval of the Hollywood establishment, they had to obey the code. And that pretty much is still the case in Hollywood today. Don't follow the status quo, and you're going to have a very hard time. Another movie to ignore the code entirely and release without approval was Some Like It Hot, which was released in 1959 and very famously starred Marilyn Monroe. A running theme for the rule-breaking movies is that they all performed very, very well, which is unsurprising considering the content. Sex does sell, but so does violence and all of our other base impulses. But there are a multitude of other reasons why these movies that refused to follow the code were doing so well. One reason is that society was going through yet another change going into the 60s, which is very well known as one of the most free-spirited decades. And people were sick of moral grandstanding. They just wanted to see a good movie with a good story that didn't have a bunch of censorship and parts cut off of it to the point where it is completely unrecognisable from what the directors and writers had in mind. And also, they were absolutely sick of the constant moral grandstanding being preached to them throughout the movie. Does this sound familiar? Another reason is the allure of the forbidden. It turns out that when you tell people that they can't see something, it kind of makes them want to see it. If lots of easily offended people kicked off about a movie back then, well, that just made people want to see it even more. And in many cases, it boosted the profile of the movie and had the opposite effect of what the censors wanted. Does that also sound familiar? My shows sell out for a reason. The movie Blow Up, which was released in 1966 and directed by Michelangelo Antonioni, was extremely sexual for the time, even showing the full titty, and was among the first and only major studio releases to feature nudity. It was purposefully made in defiance of the code, and again, unsurprisingly, the film did very well. Other directors were starting to realise that movies that disobeyed the code would usually perform better. So, this started a domino effect of movies being made that purposefully ignored the code. The film industry continued following the guidelines set by the code well into the late 1950s, but after that, it really started to lose steam. Even though the code was still in effect, it was starting to become weaker, owing to the combined impact of television and also controversial directors such as Otto Preminger, who directed Anatomy of a Murder, and he demanded less censorship of his work. Another factor was American movies being outperformed by foreign movies because foreign movie companies didn't have to obey the Hays Code, and audiences started preferring foreign movies to the homegrown stuff. So the Hays Code was actually making it harder for Hollywood to compete. As a result, directors were starting to push boundaries again, and intervention from the courts, including the US Supreme Court, was starting to become too overwhelming for studios to keep up with. And in 1968, after several years of little to no enforcement of the Hays Code, since studios were just straight up ignoring it now, the Hays Code was replaced by the MPAA, or the Motion Picture Association of America Film Rating System, which is today simply the MPA, where instead of controlling the content of the movies, they just slap an age rating on it. Some of the legal troubles that first affected the Hays Code were actually due to antitrust laws. It turns out that all movie studios and cinemas either using the Hays Code or only showing or working with movies that abided by the Hays Code actually breached monopoly laws. So, to allow for some competition, a lot of new theatres started to show movies that were not covered by the Hays Code. And of course, these movies ended up being extremely popular. As a result of all of this, the Hays Code was ultimately abandoned, which, to be fair, was for the better, because art is so much better when it's allowed to push all of the boundaries when it's telling its story. And as a result, Hollywood went on to produce a lot of amazing classics that would not have been possible if the Hays Code was still in place. Turns out censorship makes art suck. Who fucking knew? And as a result of the Hays Code being abandoned, during the 70s and 80s, Hollywood produced some astounding, fantastic, and amazing films. Even though the purpose of the Hays Code was to enforce a pre-approved morality on the entire population, the population shifted anyway. There was absolutely nothing the Hays Code could do to stop it. And all that happened as a result was audiences went elsewhere for the type of media that they wanted to consume, because Hollywood just wasn't making it. It's just another of the many examples of why censorship really isn't a good thing. And in the long run, quite frankly, it doesn't actually work. So I'm very happy that Hollywood is now completely free to make whatever type of movies that they want, even if all of the stuff that comes out of Hollywood nowadays is complete dog shit. But don't worry, it won't be forever. Our own 70s should hopefully start soon.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody should subscribe!